Okay, so good morning, everybody. We're so happy to have you here for our second webinar of the year. We will wait just a couple of minutes before we start in order to let all the people of the audience enter on the platform, and then we will begin. We're very happy of the host that we have today, the speaker who will tell us about China in Asia, and in a few minutes we will start. In the meanwhile, I would kindly ask you to turn off your microphone and your camera, please. And later on, we will tell you how to move. You will be able also, if you want to turn on both your microphone and your camera. But just for the, during the presentation of the speaker, we kindly ask you not to. Okay, so let's start. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you here. Today we will welcome Lorenzo Lamperti in this very exciting and incredibly interesting webinar. I am Alessia Paolillo, and I am the head of strategic communication of European Guanxi, and I will be the moderator of this webinar. Lorenzo Lamperti is the head of international news, a section of the daily online newspaper Affaritaliani. He deals with international politics, with particular attention to East Asia and to geopolitical dynamics between regional and global powers. So he is a professional journalist working in this field for years. So today we will be talking about the rise of China and the sudden unpredictability of the United States in the Trump era that have found effects on the order of East and South Asia. So this webinar will deal with the movements of the middle powers such as Japan and India, the Korean Knot, and the varied approach of the ASEAN countries. Other issues that will be covered are international cooperation initiatives, from the Belt and Road to bilateral treaties, and topics of tension from South China Sea to dispute borders. This webinar will offer a map of the current Sino-Asiatic geopolitics. So I will now leave the word to Lorenzo. I would like to remind you that at the end of his presentation, you will be able to ask your question. But before doing that, please write me in my private chat if you want to ask a question, if you want to ask directly or not, if you want me to read it, or if you want to post a question, and also write down what the question will be about, so that then we can move on smoothly. And at the end of the webinar, don't run away, because we will have a very interesting poll to submit to you for collecting ideas for the newsletter. So thank you so much. And now I will leave the floor to Lorenzo.
Thank you, Alessia, and thank you to European Guanxi. I'm really happy to be here today, especially because I think we usually tend to talk a lot about US-China relationships and about European and China relationships. But actually, I think that in this specific time of history, Asia, especially Eastern Asian or Indo-Pacific, if you will, is becoming as central to geopolitics as Europe was during the Cold War. I think that trends already underway have taken on greater speed during the pandemic, such as China's rise, of course. We know now that Beijing could become the first world economy in 2028. Anyway, a year more or a year less, such a thing looks inevitable. Even more after it was able, China, to go out of the pandemic sooner than US and Europe. But this could be said for a bigger part of Asia, because, for example, Vietnam and Taiwan are other big examples of economic resilience. All of these three countries increased, the GDP increased even in the pandemic, the first pandemic year. And even diplomatically, more and more governments are understanding the importance not only of China, but of Asian middle powers such as Japan, whose also geopolitical ambitions are also on rise, and India, for example, but also the dynamic galaxy of Southeast Asia. Of course, the pandemic also highlighted contradiction in relation between China and the Asian middle powers that have become more evident than in the past. Beijing, already engaged in the global challenge with Washington, as we know, finds itself having to face the increasingly aligned movements of its neighbors, committed to reducing their economic and diplomatic dependence on China. From one side, of course, there were increased tensions with middle powers on territorial disputes, for example, as with Japan on Senkaku Islands, or Diaoyu, as China called them, or even Diaoyutai, as Taiwan called them. And of course, India, with the standoff of the last June, but as well on South China Sea with Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. China was perceived as more assertive, as last June standoff with India showed, even the trade war with Australia, and especially the new Coast Guard law was perceived as a threat by Japan and many Southeast Asian countries. About this law, the National People's Congress Standing Committee in Beijing passed it in the last January, and this law expressly lets the Coast Guard use force. The law prescribes all necessary means to stop foreign vessels, including use of weapons aboard Chinese ships. We have to remember that the Coast Guard fleet of about 200 boats regularly encounters vessels from Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. I mean, another sign of and this is another sign of the militarization of South China Sea, East China Sea in some way. It's true that US still has the most powerful fleet, but China is developing since long time an astounding asymmetric naval strength with military and civil fields more and more intertwined. Of course, it remained to be understood how the strategic convergence between regional actors can become so intertwined. Since 2015, Tokyo, for example, has participated in naval tests with India and the US, and in 2019, there were also land exercises. Cooperation extended to Australia, which in recent months has signed defensive agreements with Japan and for the sharing of military bases with India. A sort of return to the Quad project evoked by Abe Shinzo himself during a visit to New Delhi in 2007, in which he poses the rhetorical foundation for Great Asia or Indo-Pacific theater. The project, as we know, never turned into an actual alliance, not least because of Donald Trump's geopolitical retreat of America first. But Japan expressed satisfaction with a continuation of practical cooperation between the member countries of the Quad, because after Biden arrived at the White House, United States, Japan, India, and Australia, they held a meeting of the heads of diplomacy of those countries, which was held in a video conference just a couple of days ago. According to a note from the Japanese Foreign Ministry, the four ministers welcomed the decision to organize the meeting in the early days of the US Biden administration. This is really a powerful sign from Washington that Washington wants to come back to Asia after the Trump's retreat. But anyway, we have to remember that Japan, for example, Suga Yoshihide, the new prime minister, repeated many times that the Quad can't become an Asian NATO, as someone likes to think. Even India, for example, presents problems with its military cooperation with Russia. What I think the middle powers want, and also the Southeast Asian countries want, is reassurance by the Joe Biden's administration. This is what they would like. Partners too often forgotten during the 4-year period that just ended. For example, Donald Trump did not intervene on the diplomatic clash still ongoing between Japan and South Korea, it jeopardized the renewal of the defensive agreements with Seoul and launched an anti-Chinese enlistment campaign that has created more than a few discontent mostly for the lack of consultation and for the methods considered too aggressive. Joe Biden's job will first to be reassure those partners. And I think the appointments of experienced diplomats, starting with the so-called Asian Tsar, Kurt Campbell, go in this direction. But those who think that the return to the pivot to Asia of Barack Obama must keep in mind that in the meantime, Asia has changed. China has grown again, and the regional middle powers have moved to try to do without an American partner who has become suddenly unpredictable. Reaffirming Washington's moral leadership role in Asia and building a grand alliance to contain Beijing will be not an easy task for Biden's team. During his tenure, we have to remember that Donald Trump often also underestimated ASEAN as an institution, the Association of the Nation of Southeast Asia countries. And the individual Asian countries have been mostly used to try to launch an enlistment campaign against Beijing on issues such as the South China Sea or the Mekong Delta, with little success, given that Southeast Asia is the area most exposed to China, as well as one of the areas that is most dependent on it, economically speaking. In reference to China, the Biden administration seems to be trying to strengthen relations with the countries of Southeast Asia as well. But Biden shouldn't force them to choose their side. For example, warned The Economist recently that Biden will gain more influence without asking too much in return to these Southeast Asian countries. Indeed, the Asian and Chinese economies are too interlinked to demand the famous or infamous decoupling. One thing is certain anyway, that Biden cannot afford to ignore Asia or the Southeast Asia. His task is particularly important in the Indo-Pacific, a region that has become really central, as we said before. The United States' presence, influence, and credibility in the region are flagging, and restoring them will require Biden really to climb out of a deep hole. On the other hand, all the middle powers we talk about, and also the Southeast Asian countries, the China's economic presence in the area is really crucial. Take Southeast Asia. Even with the pandemic, China's export increased, mostly because of the Belt and Road remodulation on health and pandemic prevention, but also direct foreign investment led by China increased, while other Asian powers such as Japan decreased. A perfect example of this is Indonesia, where in 2020, Chinese direct investment grew by 11% against the collapse of 40% by Japanese ones. Once the main ones in the gigantic island country. This is also why the middle powers in Southeast, they don't actually want to fight or an open confrontation with China. Washington's return to the scene does not even seem to be the basis of the new convergence. From technology to the South China Sea, the US wanted, at least with Trump, to decouple and the creation of an anti-Chinese front. But this is not convenient for the Asian actors to raise the tension, also because they are not ready to make it without Beijing. They want, with or without US, they want to create a context of strategic competition with China, of course, but that does not, however, jeopardize regional security and commercial opportunities.
Well, thank you so much for this very incredible and insightful introduction. And when you were speaking, I was taking notes because many of the things that you said reminded me of some other issues that are happening in Asia. Asia is such a complex continent, so vast, so big that all the specific issues that you need, to be careful about are never ending. And while you were talking about the Quad, I was also thinking about of this also, a relationship between India and Japan. I was also thinking about the SCO, so the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and also about, the relation that most of the countries which are in the western part of Asia are part of it, and also India is part of it. And as for the confrontation then India and China had on the fronts in with the Himalaya, on the lines with the Himalaya, also got solved inside the SCO. So also what you were talking about the Quad and India and Japan inside this Quad was, recalling me also of this fact that has happened so recently. And moreover, I was also thinking about the USA in Asia, what we were talking about, that during the Trump administration, of course, the power, the influence that the US was having on Asia has been decreasing gradually because of the kind of external politics that Trump has decided to follow. And has Biden want to recreate a sort of also presence of the US in Asia, and how difficult it would be. And I was thinking about the European Union, because as European Guanxi, we also think a lot about the role and the presence of the European Union in Asia, and particularly also in the relation with China. And I was thinking about also how for America will be very difficult to come back again in a dialogue, to build again a dialogue with the countries in Asia, while European Union maybe has never stopped to have these kind of dialogues with all the summits that are year by year and yearly taken with all the countries in the Far East. But we will see it. Probably also the presence of the EU in Asia might increase with the US. This is something that we can just speculate about and think about, but of course we will see with time. And instead, I have a lot of questions also to all the people in the audience. Please, as I was telling you before, if you have questions, just write to me in my private chat, the question, your name, and if you want to post the question directly or you want me to read it. So thank you so much. But in the meantime, while I will leave you the floor to write down your questions or to think about them, even though I think there are many questions we want to ask Lorenzo also for all the insight that he gave us. I will try to just stay brief and to pick only 1-2 questions of the enormous quantity of questions that I would like to ask you. And the first one is about Myanmar, because of course you were also talking about in some way of all the floors and the fields in which China is present in Asia, and the interconnection of each Asian country with China. And recently we are witnessing disorders and turbulences in Myanmar. And I have read that recently the Chinese ambassador in Myanmar has released a declaration, and it's been the first time since the beginning of the Gulf. And he has said that this is not what we want to see. I think they are very meaningful words, and I would also like you to elaborate on them, to explain to us, what has happened. And also talking about the influence that China has in the area, what could be the repercussions on Myanmar, for what you have seen? So this is the first one. And then I will also ask you the second.
Of course. I think after that we can also, I can of course dig more on some countries, for example, Japan or South Korea and India, and as well as you said about the European presence in Asia, that I think it's an important topic. I feel that European Union too often thought about Asia only on the commercial side. As we saw, we closed many bilateral agreements, for example, with Singapore or Vietnam. But now I think there is a need to think in a more strategical way, the more comprehensive way. And we can see that, for example, Germany, France, and even UK, they are sending even military ships actually on the East China Sea, on the South China Sea for military exercise, joint military exercise with Japan in particular. Anyway, maybe we can come back on that later. About Myanmar, as you pointed out, I think, of course, it's the first probably test on China-US US relationship in Biden's era. Let's start from the beginning. Of course, the Beijing's public statements in response to the coup have been more neutral to mildly critical at a maximum, with the state media describing the coup as a major cabinet reshuffle in the beginning, as we read on the Global Times, while the ambassador to Myanmar, as you remember, said China was unhappy with the situation. This happened after more than a couple of weeks. What happened in this couple of weeks? Of course, while Western countries have strongly condemned the coup, China has been more cautious, emphasizing the importance of stability. But I have to say that this is what you expect from China, because not interference in other countries' internal affairs, as we know, is the principal concept of Chinese foreign policy. And this is also actually the same line of many neighbor countries, such as Thailand, for example. State Department, US State Department tried to call on Beijing to play a more constructive, as they say, role about the Myanmar coup. And after some hesitation, China nonetheless agreed to a UN Security Council statement that called for the release of the elected leader Aung San Suu Kyi, who was detained. She's detained since February 1st. Widespread protests against the military coup in Myanmar have taken, in the meantime, on an increasingly anti-Chinese tone, with rallies held outside the Chinese embassy in Yangon, for example, and many people that are calling for boycotts of Chinese goods and services. I think misinformation is spreading, I have to say, because including rumors that Chinese soldiers have infiltrated Myanmar and that Chinese software will be used to set up Burmese version of the Chinese Great Firewall. Of course, the Chinese ambassador has attempted to dispel these rumors, but to little effect, because the Chinese embassy in Yangon, as I said, has attracted thousands of anti-coup protesters every day in the last week. Why this? Okay, why someone can think that China is behind the coup? Of course, because China is developing numerous projects in Myanmar under the Belt and Road, One Belt, One Road project, within an economic corridor that aims to guarantee Beijing a direct access to the Bay of Bengal through the port of Kyaukpyu and the special economic zone that was built just around this port. And this also will help to improve the condition of border areas of China. At the same time, promoting the Burmese infrastructural development. In 2020, the Chinese capital in the country reached more than $130 million. And this is over almost the 40% of the total foreign investment in the country. So we can understand how important is the economic relationship between China and Myanmar, especially for Naypyidaw. At the beginning of 2020, Xi Jinping visited Naypyidaw, and he signed 38 memorandums of understanding. But during this year, 29 of these 38 memorandums are still to be approved, also because of the pandemic situation. But looking back, it turns out that the end of the military junta coincided with a vertical decline in Chinese project and loans in Myanmar. And this is a trend that is not easy to find somewhere else in Southeast Asia. And probably this is to be attributed on the one hand to the need to contain debt that it was really increasing the Myanmar debt with China, and on the other hand, to a growing diversification of NIPDO's partners. For example, there was a big Japan's investment competition in Myanmar, as well as a political competition by India, actually, who entered also in the military field. Just some months ago, New Delhi has given Myanmar a submarine, a military submarine, and India has also won the race for the vaccine, anti-COVID-19 vaccine. They just donated to Myanmar 1.5 million doses in the recent weeks, and then the Myanmar government stopped the approval of the Chinese vax and bought another 30 million doses of that made by Serum, the Indian one. And Japan and India actually were also not so aggressive in condemning the coup, and they are shy, I have to say, on taking the stance, Biden's stance on sanctions against the military. We have to remember that just a few weeks ago, before the coup, the foreign minister of China, Wang Yi, started his tour of Southeast Asia exactly from Myanmar, also meeting with members of Tatmadaw, the Burmese army. And this could create some rumors about China's role. But we tend to forget that in a very recent visit to Myanmar, also the Japanese foreign minister Motegi Toshimitsu met with both Suu Kyi and the General Min Aung Hlaing, as did his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi. And in fact, as Japan, China has cultivated positive relationships with both factions, so both the army and the National League for Democracy. Xi and Suu Kyi, they are both sons of revolutionary fathers. They met several times, and they really cultivated a very strong relationship. They spoke many times of a blood bond between the two peoples. And there have been, on the other way, some frictions between China and the army, in particular on the issue of the ethnic Chinese armed militias in the north of Myanmar. And the Burmese armed forces suspect that Beijing has somehow supported them, underlining the discovery of Chinese weapons in the hands of Kachin independence groups. While, on the other hand, on several occasions, bombs have fallen on Chinese territory, even causing some victims during the last 10 years. So the feeling, I have to say, that rather than siding with one faction or another, what Beijing wants really is stability, that it's a necessary precondition for doing business and preventing chaos from reaching the shared border, already shaken, as we said, by ethnic turmoil. But anti-Chinese sentiment has a long history in Myanmar, both on the national level and on the local level, due, as we said before, to conflicts among ethnic Chinese communities and Burmese majority. And Chinese investment projects have been a major flashpoint, especially the Midson Dam, which was suspended. It was a huge project, which was suspended in 2011, following the move towards the democracy. And locals were decried about the environmental impacts and forced relocation associated with such project. Of course, this coup, what could it mean? The consequence, what could be? That can mean on one hand, that China is blamed even when it hasn't actually done much. And as with anti-US feelings, resentment follows hegemony, and China's rise has created some such feeling of fear in many Asian countries. But as we said, one of the reasons why Myanmar's military allowed limited democracy in the last decade was out of fear that it was becoming too dependent on China as its only baker, since it was cut off from the rest of the world through sanctions. So the military now seems to value its own power over the risk of a new huge dependence on a giant neighbor. Even if, as we said before, India doesn't want to leave the floor only on China, even with the military on power. In the case of new international sanctions, of course, China could see some of its companies listed in the states penalized, but it could again represent an obligatory choice for the military, as well as India, as we said. And so there are those who fear that a new division of the region into spheres of influence, as in the days of the Cold War, and in the Asian context, an autocratic Myanmar could join Laos, Thailand, and Cambodia in a circle of countries that are inclined to support more Beijing, for example, in some delicate issue as the the sea disputes with the other Southeast Asian countries. And this is Japan's stance. Tokyo believes that the coup could in the end increase China's influence in the region. I think that the game is still really open because the situation is not clear, and we will see what will happen in Myanmar in the next weeks and months.
Also, because as you were just correctly pointed out, there are two things that we need to remember carefully: is that Beijing doesn't want to have so many, confusions or turbulences in countries with which it has some economic bounds, because of course, states of turbulences, war, social disorders don't encourage, business. So for this reason, probably also Beijing prefers to have very stability in regions or states with which it has some economic bounds. Yeah. And also the importance of the position of Myanmar, and so also of the relation that it could create and enhance with China, together with Thailand and Cambodia, because they all, talking about the dispute of the South China Sea, also having these three countries as sort of allies could help a lot China in that dispute, which is a very broad dispute, which is a long going one, and ever increasing. So that's a lot to think about it. And talking about,
it's crucial. Sorry, Alessia. I think it's crucial to understand what Asian countries will want to do about Myanmar, because we always see Myanmar through a Western American or European perspective, but this does not help us to understand what's happening in there, what happened there in the past, and as in the past. In 2010, when the transition to democracy began, that was largely thanks to the Asian countries. For example, the commitment of Indonesia and India as well. So we have to see now where China, for example, and India as well, see the stability. If they think the army can provide more stability, or if the real democracy and the possible return of Aung San Suu Kyi can be better. I think that this is the key point, and we always focus on what US and Europe think about this situation, but I have to say that I think that it's more important probably what China, India, and other Asian countries think about it.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I just wanted to connect with the second question that I wanted to ask you. Also about the situation in South China Sea, or the countries which are part of this dispute. And among them, there are the Philippines, which is a very interesting country to study, because with the Duterte administration, Duterte government, the historical bond that the Philippines had built with the US has become a little bit more tricky, let's say. It's been falling apart, or at least at the beginning of the Duterte government, because he was, receiving lots of agreements that he had with the US to move more towards China. But now the relations that the Philippines are establishing with China as with the US are still ambiguous. So what do you think could be the repercussions of on China about also how the Philippines and the Duterte government is posing itself in the area?
I think this is a very good question, because I think that the Philippines actually are the most shaky country probably in this particular time, because as we know, for example, staying on the Southeast Asian countries, as we already said, Cambodia, Laos, maybe Thailand in some way, are closer to China. Even Brunei, that is the chairman of ASEAN for 2021. On the other side, we see Singapore and Vietnam, mostly Vietnam, that is the most assertive on the disputes with territorial dispute against China. As you pointedly, how the Philippines are more shaky with Duterte in the last years, and it's interesting enough actually that it's really been a while since the president Rodrigo Duterte hasn't been talked about outside this country in the last weeks, even last months. I think that he's waiting for Biden to understand what can happen, and he's trying to have more leverage in the bilateral negotiation. Why this? Because in the last weeks, representatives from the Philippines and the United States actually will meet, not last weeks, but in the next weeks, to resolve their differences over the visiting forces agreement that you were mentioned. The agreement was signed in 1998 to strengthen the military cooperation between US and the Philippines. We have to remember that the Philippines were a former colony of America. Duterte has said many times that he had the intention to withdraw from this agreement, only to then suspend the procedure and keep suspending and waiting for the Trump's era to end and the Biden's one to begin. And the Philippine Foreign Secretary Teodoro Locsin made it known in the last days that he will meet with US representatives in the last week of February. So in just some days later, the suspension was decided to allow the Philippines to continue working and reduce distances. This is the official line of the Manila government. But they took an excuse from when the US authority has denied a visa to his ally, to Duterte ally, the Senator Ronald Bato de la Rosa, accused of extra killings. We know that the Philippines with Duterte are fighting a very violent war on drugs. The visiting forces agree, but in reality, the Philippines are shaky even with the geopolitical position. The visiting forces agreement, what is that? Basically guarantees the legal framework under which the US troops can operate in the Philippines, and in fact allows for the implementation of the Mutual Defense Treaty. In this regard, it should be emphasized that the US-Philippines meeting comes at the time of maximum tension between Beijing and Manila. This is again about the new Coast Guard law that we talked at the beginning of this webinar. But again, the Philippines government is currently divided on the approach to be followed towards China after it approved this new law. For example, there was someone, the presidential spokesman Harry Rock, suggested that taking China to the International Tribunal for the Law of Sea. But no one, for example, the foreign secretary Locsin himself, he rejected this hypothesis. And no word has come from the Rodrigo Duterte so far, to testify perhaps what I said before. I mean, how the Philippines are still undecided on the strategy to be implemented in response to China, not only on this matter. In the meantime, however, the pressure is growing from the Fishermen's Association, for example, which are asking the government to take a harder line against Beijing. So I think we have to wait probably some weeks or some days to understand if Philippines and US with Biden can align on the visiting forces agreement and see what Duterte will do in his last year of presidency, because in 2022 Philippines will go to vote again, and probably Duterte's daughter actually will run. For understanding the complex relationship with China, Philippines is one of the countries that will receive China's vaccine against the COVID-19.
Sorry, I didn't turn on my microphone. Yes, I totally agree with you. Also, that the situation in the Philippines is really ambiguous and really tricky and difficult to tackle. So thank you so much also for clarifying a lot of controversies, or I think it's very difficult to really understand. And while we were talking, I was receiving a lot of questions and people who want to ask you questions. So I will now leave the floor to the first one, who is Malvina Montini, who wanted to ask you personally some questions. So I will leave them directly to her.
Thank you.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for your presentation. I really appreciate that. And I have two questions that are connected with the United States and the relations with China. My first question is related to the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. How this strategy will change now that Biden is president of the US, and how China could react. And my second question is, since Biden is more proactive in the Taiwan issue, how is going to deal it with China's defensive reaction? This is my two questions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Malvina. These are two very sensitive points, of course, in U.S.-China relationship. As I said before, the last days there was a first virtual summit between the Quad foreign ministers. So we are talking about US, India, Japan, and Australia. Just in the last month of 2020, actually, there was also a joint exercise in Malabar, India, after many years that this didn't happen because Australia withdraw usually from these joint exercises. But after the trade war with China this year, Australia went back. I think that Biden will try to restore alliances, no matter if we are talking about Quad or, for example, trilateral relationship with Japan and South Korea, because, for example, we were talking before about the mini trade war between not only trade but also diplomatic war between Japan and South Korea, and Trump actually didn't try to help the two pillars of American strategy in Eastern Asia to went back together. But now we have signs that Biden wants it, because, for example, just the other day, the new Secretary of State Antony Blinken had a trilateral call with his counterpart, South Korean counterpart and Japanese counterpart. So I think that Biden will try to get a more broader, more consultative alliance. I don't want to say against China, but in competition with China, trying to involving more these countries in any kind of the decision and being more predictable. This is what Asian countries want more than ever, especially, for example, Japan or South Korea or even the Southeast East Asian countries, they want predictability from Washington. About the Quad, I think it will not become a military association as NATO, as someone said. It will be a more involving platform of dialogue between these middle powers. The Japan and India, of course, are the pillars of US strategy. Even if with India, there could be some problems with Biden, more than with Trump, because Trump, we know that he had a very strong relationship, personal relationship with the Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And but during these years, we also said, I mean, US and Western world turned one eye, closed one eye, or even both eyes on what was happening in India, because we saw that Modi curbed lots of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, even of citizenship. But now the first signs we have with Biden is that he will focus on human rights, even with India, because we saw in the last weeks the farmers' protest. It's a huge protest in India that is going on since last November. And the Department of State asked India to respect the freedom of protest and also the freedom to the free access to the internet, because the Indian government also closed the access to the internet in some area of the country after the protest. So sorry, I'm going on my way. So I will be back on your question about Taiwan. Of course, this is the key point of the future relationship between China and US. We know that Trump used Taiwan a lot for attacking, not only for attacking China, but anyway, the suspect is that he did it for annoying China in some way. Just before his presidency ended, Mike Pompeo lifted the self-imposed restriction of the bilateral relationship between US and Taiwan. That we have to remember that it's not just another China, as we usually say, but it's a key player in the economical field, especially in the technological one. So, and we know how much technology is important in the competition between US and China. We know that the semiconductor, Taiwan is really the big leader, big world leader in semiconductor production. And just some months ago, Trump's administration banned TSMC, who is the biggest producer of semiconductors, to export to Huawei and other Chinese players. This created lots of issues in China that, as we know, is seeking a technological outage, technological independence, and is not ready to produce the semiconductors itself. And it was highly reliant on Taiwanese production. Of course, about Biden, it's a question, because Taiwanese, for example, they felt protected by Trump, even if I have to say, someone from the government knew that Taiwan doesn't need a passionate relationship with the US. Taiwan need a calm but predictable relationship. Of course, because Taiwan is in the front line. And China considers Taiwan, as we know, parts of its territory. About Biden, he didn't phone Tsai Ing-wen as Trump did in 2016. But for example, he invited the Taiwanese representative in Washington at his ceremony on January 20. And this is the first time that it happened since the 70s. So I think that Biden is showing that he will keep the attention on the Taiwan issue, and this could create, of course, some tension, in the big tension in the future with China.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your reply.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Since we have a lot of questions, I would like just try to answer to all of them. For the next ones, I know it's very difficult because the things to say are a lot, but if we try just to stay a little bit brief, just to give the question to everybody to pose the questions. The next question is from Isacco, and he asked me to read it for you. So it was asking about the BRI, so the Belt and Road Initiative, and he wanted to ask you if we can consider that the strong presence of Chinese companies in various projects of the BRI, like the acquisitions or investments in ports and harbors in the South China Sea, in the Mediterranean, on the Mar Caspio, has a relevance from a geopolitical point of view.
Okay. Of course, I think it's naive to think that Belt and Road is only a commercial project, infrastructural project. It's also a geopolitical project. But I don't think that, as Trump loved to say, that China wants to dominate the world. I think that China wants to dominate itself. And how to dominate itself with its huge territory and still, of course, open scars of the humiliation century, as well as Hong Kong, for example, or the Taiwan and other territorial disputes. He needed the Belt and Road project to be more ambitious, and for a lot of economical reasons that now we don't have the time to explore. I think that the most relevant part of the Belt and Road is in the south of the world. I mean, Southeast Asia and Africa. This is where China really wants to keep its mark. China wants to stay there. China is since very long time in Africa. It's not a new thing. I usually laugh when I see our media talking in a surprising way that China is doing some business in Africa, because it's a thing that is going on since Mao Zedong. So, and I think it's really interesting to read what Xi Jinping said in Davos just some weeks ago. He openly talked about the world South. So I think that China wants to be the, probably, yeah, we can say the leader of the world South. So proposing an alternative model to multilateralism.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's also true that, in fact, the interest that China was having on Africa started in the 50s, in the 50-55, where we were seeing Zhou Enlai going back and forth from Africa. So this is something that's most of the time is forgotten. And next question is from Jessica and Milano, and she wants to ask it directly. So we'll leave the floor to her.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm sorry I cannot turn on my camera. So thank you, Alessia, and thank you to Lorenzo Lamperti for being with us. I wanted to ask you, how do you see the European presence, but especially the influence in the Indo-Pacific region? Like we've seen the EU signed different free trade agreements with single states, but we also have some intergovernmental frameworks of cooperation, such as the European Asia meeting. So do you think these European efforts are working? And also considering the China-US tensions, let's say the Asian perception, the perceptions of the EU among the Asian countries may be more positive, like they would welcome the European influence more, or not? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think that in Europe, we are talking a lot about the strategic autonomy, right? I think we are still far from that. Because as you correctly said, we signed lots of economical frameworks with some countries, even with China. The last one, the agreement on investment of just signed on December 30. 2020. But I think what it lacks is a common view among European countries of how to relate to China, Asia, not only them, but even with the Middle East, Russia, and US. So talking about the European strategy, I think it's still very complicated. It's true that, for example, Germany released last year a framework on the Indo-Pacific strategy, and it's also considering to send a warship of the German Navy to Japan. And this will demonstrate the growing attention paid by Berlin and even by the international community to the geopolitical dynamics in the Indo-Pacific region. Also, France actually will join a US-Japan military exercise, as I think I said before, and even Netherlands is present. UK, as we said, that after Brexit is focusing on build a stronger relationship with Southeast and Eastern Asian countries. I think that Europe is still thinking in a commercial way and not in a strategical one. So, of course, making business with Asia is inevitable, with China itself as well. Of course, we are highly reliant on China's economy, as we said as we saw in 2020. So it's naive to think that Europe will decouple. I think that Europe should focus on ASEAN, for example, because I think the European Union and ASEAN has a lot in common. They don't want to choose which side to stay between US and China. And I think we should go in that direction, thinking not only in a commercial way, but also in a strategical way.
Thank you very much. I think it's very thought-provoking. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the next question is from Alice Colantoni, who wanted to ask you about the Mixty Alliance, which also for the audience we will run is called in this way because all the countries who are part of this alliance drink tea with milk, is something that is generally not done in China, even though it's spreading also now in mainland China, but at the beginning was not like that. So the Mixty Alliance strong condemned the military coup in Myanmar. So we're going back to the facts of Myanmar. And however, due to the complicated relations between China and Hong Kong and between China and Taiwan, could it be seen as a deterioration of these relations, or China will try to maintain a neutral stance with them?
Well, first of all, I have to say that the Mixty Alliance for now, it's social media alliance, of course, because it's mostly an hashtag. We don't have governments allied against China under a Mixty Alliance. Also because, of course, the governments are usually, except for Taiwan, Hong Kong government is pro-Beijing. Myanmar government as well is pro-Beijing. And in Thailand, the other country involved in this social phenomenon is also, of course, not against Beijing. I think it's interesting that the young generation are coming together even in Asia. So this is an interesting sign. Also, if we read and listen to what the Burmese protesters are saying, they don't want a status quo. They don't want promises from the military. They really want something now. So it's interesting, and it's a phenomenon that we have to follow for understanding where Asia will go. Also because the pandemic, I have to say, increased the repression of many rights in the area, not only in Myanmar or Thailand, but even in Hong Kong, but even, for example, in Vietnam, we had lots of arrests in the last year. So there are lots of countries that are really young. For example, in Vietnam, more than the almost the half of the population is under 30 age of 30. So I think that where the young generation of Asia will want to go is, of course, a very important matter, and the Mixty Alliance could be a begin to understand it.
Thank you so much. And now we will go to the end of our meeting. So we have one last question from Stefano Mancuso, who will ask it directly. So if you could please at least turn on your microphone. If you have problems with the camera, it's not is okay. So I will leave it to you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Lorenzo, for your presentation. I wanted to ask you if after this pandemic, China seems to be one of the few countries which has seen a positive rate of growth in 2020. But anyway, it is possible it will have a lot of difficulties in order to start again to invest in a really impressive way on the Belt and Road Initiative. And the second question is about 5G. As you said before, the war on technology is a big issue between China and US, and how it will in the future, especially because the pandemic has underlined how the technology is more important than in the past, and especially the security of the networks. It will need to be improved in order to secure the national security. I mean, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Stefano. The first one, I think it's a really good question. I actually think that the Belt and Road was already a little bit on retreat before the pandemic, and the pandemic is accelerating this retreat. Not just because other countries are more wary of China, but because China itself. China understood, first of all, that the Belt and Road, label on every investment could trigger some paranoia, some fear. I think this was kind of let's say kind of a mistake, because now we see every Chinese presence as a threat. Of course, it's not true. It's not true. Everyone does business with China, and everyone should do business with China. It's how we do business with China that matters. About the Belt and Road in the next years, probably it will not disappear, of course, because it's in the constitution of the Communist Party. But China will reconsider a little bit the amount probably of its investment abroad. We talked a lot in the last months about the dual circulation that it was theorized by Xi Jinping during his trip to Guangdong last October before the 5th plenum took office. I think China will try to focus, as we said before, to a more, for example, technological self-reliance, and also he will try to push the internal consumption. He don't want to be the world's factory anymore, because China understood that now it's under the radar of US, and not only US, so he can't rely only on exports. He needs to build a very strong internal market, which actually it already did, but China wants to go on this path. About the second part is also connected, because as you said, the technological issue, of course, is probably the most delicate issue in the US-China competition, because it's technology is not just technology. Technology is geopolitics. So who controls technology also controls geopolitics. China took some advantage in the last years because US, and not only US, were focused on other matters. Now, of course, I think that with Biden, this will not change. So we will not see that Huawei will be back to US just as nothing happened. I think that on this particular dossier, Biden will keep Trump's line. So also on this, China will need to build its internal structures, especially about the semiconductors that we were talking before.
Great, thank you so much. Also, it's important just to remember that the virtual field is also right now the field that we can see in reality. So, you know, there's also kind of geopolitics of the virtual world. So thank you so much for all your answers, for your presence here, for the also, you know, the insights that you gave to us. I think that all the people of the audience has been really happy about it and was pleasant with it. So I will thank you again for your presence here. It's been great for us to have you here as a speaker. And to the audience, I will just ask you not to rush away, because now we follow a small poll to questions that which you should answer, and the results will be shared. So thank you so much and goodbye. After the poll, we will close our webinar.
Thank you, Alessia. Thank you, everyone.